Hi everyone, I am Dr.V.VIJI, Associate Professor of Economics, A.D.M. College for Women, Autonomous, Nagapattinam. Today we will going to see the principle of effective demand. In this we have to see aggregate demand and aggregate supply in this equilibrium. Before that we have to see the introduction of macroeconomics. The term macro was first used in economics by Rancher Frisch in 1933, but as a methodological approach to economic problems. It originated with the mercantilists in the 16th and 17th centuries. They were concerned with the economic system as a whole. In the 18th century, the physiocrats adopted their economics to show the circulation of wealth among the three classes, represented by farmers, landowners, and the sterile classes. Malthus, Sismondi, and Marx in the 19th century dealt with macroeconomics problems. Walras, Wichel, and Fisher were the modern contributors to the development of macroeconomic analysis. Before Keynes, certain economists like Cashel, Marshall, Pigou, Robertson, Hayek, and Havre developed a theory of money and general prices in that decade. Following the First World War, but credit going to Keynes, who finally developed a general theory of income, output, and employment in the wake of the Great Depression. Now let us see the nature of macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is the study of aggregate or average, covering the entire economy, such as total employment, national income, national output, total investment, total consumption, total savings, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. The general price level, wage level, and cost structure. In other words, it is the aggregative economics which examines the interrelations among the various aggregates, their determinants, and causes of fluctuations in them. Thus, in the word of Professor Aggregate, macroeconomics deals with economic affairs in the large. It concerns the overall dimension of economic life. Macroeconomics is also known as the theory of income and employment, or simply income analysis. It is concerned with the problems of unemployment, economic fluctuations, inflation or deflation, international trade, and economic growth. The observe of macroeconomics is microeconomics. Microeconomics is the study of the economic actions of individuals and small groups of individuals. The study of particular firm, particular households, individual prices, wages, incomes, individual industries, particular commodities. But macroeconomics deals with aggregate of these quantities, not with individual incomes, but with the national income, not with individual price, but with the price level, not with the individual output, but with the national output. Both microeconomics and macroeconomics involve the study of aggregates, but aggregation in microeconomics is different from that in macroeconomics. For example, aggregates numerous firms or even products consumer demand. For source is an aggregate of the demands of many households and the supply of them. Logical starting point of Keynes' theory of employment is the principle of effective demand. In a capitalist economy, the level of employment depends on effective demand. Thus, unemployment results from a deficiency of effective demand, and the level of employment can be increasing the level of effective demand. Effective demand. In ordinary parlance, demand means desire it become effective. When income is spent in buying, consumption, goods and investment goods. Keynes used the term effective demand to denote the total demand for goods and services at various levels of employment. The value of aggregate demand at the point of aggregate demand function where it is intersect by the aggregate supply function will be called the effective demand. Thus, according to Keynes, the level of employment is determined by effective demand, which in turn is determined by aggregate demand price and aggregate supply price. Now we have to see the aggregate demand price. The aggregate demand price for the output of any given amount of employment is the total sum of money of proceeds, which is expected from the sale of the output proceed when that amount of labor is employed. A statement showing the various aggregate demand prices at different levels of employment is called the aggregate demand price schedule or aggregate demand function. The table reveals that with the increase in the level of employment proceeds, expected rise at lower levels of employment decline. The aggregate demand curve can be drawn on the basis of the above schedule. Now let us see the aggregate demand schedule. Here we have to take two components. One is level of employment in lakhs. Another one is aggregate demand price in rupees crores. Here we have to see the aggregate level of employment. That is 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45 and 50 in terms of lakhs. Here the level of employment is increased from 20 to 25, 25 to 30, 30 to 35 and up to 50. The level of employment is overall increased from 20 to 50 in lakhs. Another one is aggregate demand price. The aggregate demand price is increased from 230, 240, 250, 260, 270, 280, 290. Here, the aggregate demand price also increased in terms of crores from 230 to 290. Overall, the employment also increased from the 20 to 50 and the aggregate demand price also increased from 230 to 290. Now we will pass on to aggregate supply price. This is one more big component in the effective demand. When an entrepreneur gives employment to certain amount of labor, it requires certain quantities of current factors like land, capital, raw materials, etc., which will be paid remuneration along with the labor. Thus, each level of employment involves certain money costs of production, including normal profits which the entrepreneur must cover. A statement showing the various aggregate supply price at different levels of employment is called the aggregate supply price schedule or aggregate supply function. In the words of Professor Dillard, the aggregate supply function is a schedule of the minimum amounts of proceeds required to induce varying quantities of employment. Here we have to see the aggregate demand schedule. Here we have to take on two components. One is level of employment in lakhs. Another one is aggregate supply price in crores. Here the aggregate demand schedule, the level of employment is increased from 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 40, 40. Here we have to see the level of employment is increased from 20 to 40. After two stages, the level of employment maintained at a constant level, that is 40 lakhs and 40 lakhs. Then another components aggregate supply price. It is increased from 215 to 305, that is 215, 230, 245, 260, 275, 290, 295. The aggregate supply price, it is gradually increased from 215 to 395. Now we will see the determination of effective demand. We have studied the two determinations of effective demand separately and now are in the position to analyze. The process of determining the level of employment is determined at the point of where the aggregate demand price equals the aggregate supply price. In other words, it is the point where what entrepreneurs expect to receive equals what they must receive and their profits are maximized. The points of effective demand is, however, not necessarily one of full employment but of underemployment equilibrium. The following table explains the determination of the points of effective demand. Now let us see the combined table of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Level of employment in lakhs, aggregate supply price in crores, aggregate demand price in lakhs and aggregate price in crores. Now let us see the employment rate. That is, it is increased from 20, 25, 30, 35. After that, it is maintained at a constant level. That is 40 lakhs, 40 lakhs, 40 lakhs. And aggregate supply price, here it is increased from 215, 220, 245, 260, 75, 290, 305. Then we have to see the aggregate demand price. It will be changed from one level to another level. So here we have to take an old aggregate demand price and new aggregate demand price. The old aggregate demand price is increased from 230 to 290, but the new aggregate demand price is increased from 235 to 295. Here we have to see the combined effect of this effective demand. Now let's illustrate the determination of effective demand, where AD is the aggregate demand function and AS is the aggregate supply function. The horizontal axis measures the level of employment in the economy and the vertical axis of proceeds expected, revenue and the process necessary cost. The two curves AD and AS intersect each other at point E. This is called, or this is effective demand, where ON workers are employed at this point. The entrepreneur's expectations of profits are maximized. At any point other than this, the entrepreneurs will either incur losses or earn subnormal profits. Now let us see the diagrammatical explanations. Here we have to see ASAD, and these two curves are intersect at the level of E. This is called effective demand. Here x-axis represents the level of employment in the economy and y-axis represents cost and the revenue in the economy. Of the two determinants of effective demand, Keynes records the aggregate supply function to be given because it depends on the technical condition of production, the availability of raw materials, machines, etc., which do not change in the short run. It is therefore the aggregate demand function which plays a vital role in determining the level of employment in the economy. According to Keynes, the aggregate demand function depends on the consumption function and investment function. If the aggregate demand function is raised beyond this point, the economy will experience inflation because all the existing resources are fully employed and their supply cannot be increased during the short period, as in apparent from the vertical portion of the AS curve is figure 2. Here we have to see the x-axis represents the total employment of the economy and y-axis represents total cost and revenue of the economy. Here we have to take only one aggregate supply curve and we have to see the two types of AD curves. That is, aggregate demand is shifted from one level to another level. That is, old AD it is intersect at the level of E and new aggregate demand curve is intersect at AS is E1. Here the effective demand it is increased from E to E1. In this situation, the employment level of the economy it will be increased from ON to ONF. Then the equilibrium also is shifted to E to E1. Importance of effective demand. The principle of effective demand is the most important contribution of Keynes. It is the soul of the Keynesian theory of employment. Dr. Kellin attributes the Keynesian revolution slowly to the development of a theory of effective demand. Then we have to see the determinant of employment. Effective demand determines the level of employment in the economy. When effective demand increases, employment also increases, and a decline in effective demand decreases the level of employment. Thus, unemployment is caused by a deficiency of effective demand. Effective demand represents the total expenditure on the total output produced at an equilibrium level of employment. It indicates the value of total output which equals the national income. National income equals the national expenditure. National expenditure consists of expenditure on consumption goods and investment goods. We may conclude the importance of the principles of effective demand lies in pointing out the causes and the remedy of unemployment. Reputation of Say's law and full employment. The principle of effective demand repudiates Say's law of market, that supply creates its own demand and that full employment equilibrium is a normal situation in the economy. This principle points out that underemployment equilibrium is a normal situation and full employment equilibrium is accidental. In a capitalist economy, supply fails to create its own demand because the whole of the earned income is not spent on the consumption of goods and services. Moreover, the decision to save and invest are made by different people. As a result, the existence of full employment is not a possibility and the point of effective demand at any time represents underemployment equilibrium. Thus, the importance of this principle lies in reputation of Say's law and the classical thesis of full employment equilibrium. Role of investment. The principle of effective demand highlights the significant role of investment in determining the level of employment in the economy. The two determinants of effective demand, rare consumption and investment expenditure. Here we have to take two determinants of investment, marginal efficiency of capital and marginal efficiency of investment. Where whenever the marginal efficiency of investment is increased to boost up the marginal efficiency of capital, in that situation the total economical employment and the output level will be moved from one level to another level. It also gives some more highest effective demand in the economy. When income increases, consumption expenditure also increases, but by less than the increase in income. Thus, there arises a gap between income and consumption, which leads to decline in the volume of employment. This gap can be bridged by an increase in either consumption expenditure or investment expenditure in order to achieve full employment levels of effective demand in the economy. Since the propensity to consume is suitable during the short run, it is not possible in rise the consumption expenditure. Therefore, the level of effective demand and hence of employment can be raised by an increase in investment. In this lies the importance of investment. Investment is very important to the economy. Whenever we have to raise the investment, it creates some additional productivity and output in the economy. At the same time, the GDP level will be increased to highest position. Through that way, the effective demand will be importance in the economy. The paradox of poverty in the midst of potential. The importance of effective demand lies in explaining the paradox of poverty in the midst of potential plenty in modern capitalism. Effective demand is mainly determined by the aggregate demand function, which is composed of consumption expenditure and investment expenditure. A fundamental principle is that when income increases, consumption also increases, then propensity to consumption. The marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. This creates a gap between income and consumption, which must be filled up by the required investment expenditure. If the appropriate investment is not forthcoming to fill this gap, it leads to a deficiency of effective demand, resulting in unemployment. But in a rich community, investment demand is not adequate to fill this gap and there emerges in deficiency of aggregate demand, resulting in widespread unemployment. Thank you.